So, yesterday's class we talked about transport in humans. We talked about the structure of the heart. It has four chambers, two atria and two ventricles, distributed as the right and left atrium and the right and left ventricle. And to keep in mind that the illustration or image of the heart is always mirrored. So your left is the right side of the heart and your right side is the left side of the heart. We talked about how double circulation occurs in humans. So blood passes through the heart twice in one cycle, as compared to single circulation in other animals such as fish and amphibians, some amphibians. And also, right, the muscular structure of the heart, as well as the valves present to prevent the backflow of blood. And then the group of cells that actually initiate the pumping of the heart through an electrical impulse called the pacemaker. And a normal person would have 72 beats per minute, right? Yeah, okay. So today, let's continue. And the first thing we're going to talk about is monitoring your heart rate or pulse rate. So you can monitor the activity of the heart in a number of ways. The first is to measure your pulse. And the reason why it's called a pulse is because every time the heart beats, right, it pumps blood under pressure. Sorry, not blood, but blood. And that causes sort of a, you know, wave to pass through the arteries as the blood, this new blood coming in. A wave like pulse, right? And so that is what you're detecting. So you can detect your pulse from either your wrist, right? The part which is under your thumb. You can place your index finger on your wrist at the part under your thumb, and you can probably feel, right, a pulse, or you can feel it in your neck, right, just a bit to the side of the center of your neck, either side. Well, actually throat, not neck. So and if you place your fingers over there, you may need to press in a bit, but if you apply, you just press in your fingers in a bit on your throat, right, a bit to the side of the center, and you'll feel a pulse, right? And so those are arteries that are close, and you can use them to measure your pulse, right? It can also be detected from, using digital pulse rate monitors, and they can be attached to the wrist or the finger or the earlobe, because obviously there are vessels all around, right? Even your thumb has, like, an artery that would generate a pulse. And
our neck, which can like, make you faint if you press it too hard.
Well, no one's asking you to press it too hard, right? We
Then
just
how will you use it?
I just said you need to like press just a little bit to be able to feel it,
Oh, okay.
right? The other way that you can do it is by monitoring this heart sound. So listening to the heart. And so when you listen to the heart using, well, I mean, you could obviously put your chest to, the heart, your ear to the chest of someone you know and someone who would be comfortable with that. Otherwise, what doctors do obviously is use an instrument called a stethoscope. And so with that stethoscope, you are able to it you can not only listen to it but it amplifies the sound so you can listen to it better. And with that, the sound of the heart is something called that you can hear a lub and dub sound of the heart. And so what they actually correspond to, the lub is the sound of the closing of the atrioventricular valves. Right, so the valves between the atria and the ventricles. So when they close, there's a lub. And then the dub is, as you can guess, the closing of the semilunar valves. Now, if you've ever heard the sound of the heart beating, you'd understand how quickly it's happening, right? It's just like tuk 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 tuk. Obviously, we call it that it's lub dub scientifically, but it's happening very quickly, right? And so that gives an idea of how quickly. Obviously, if it's happening 72 times a minute, it's happening more than once per second, right? Which is fast. The third way you can monitor activity of the heart is through an ECG, right? And ECG stands for electrocardiogram. And what this does is they place electrodes, they attach electrodes to the chest, and what they do is they pick up, right, the minor current that's produced by the heart in each heartbeat, and that is displayed on a screen. And so that obviously a normal heartbeat would have like a regular pattern, and so anything wrong with that pattern, obviously, I mean, this obviously not accurate. You've probably seen it, if not in real life, then in movies or cartoons or something, right? And so because a normal beating heart gives a regular pattern, any change in the pattern would signal at some problem, right? Which the doctor could look at. Any questions?
No,
Okay.
no.
Now, as we can imagine that when we take part in any sort of physical activity, our heart rate will go up. Right? And obviously at rest or during, like, normal activity, it's 70. The book says 70 times a minute. I said 72. The book says 70 times a minute. So that's what we go with. And the reason why the activity increases because, again, right, the oxygen demand, and so that's being given by the blood, which is being pumped by the heart. So the heart is pumping faster, get the blood flowing more to get more oxygen to the body per minute, and it can increase up to 200 times a minute, which is obviously more than twice. Uh, and this is not a level of heart rate that you want to maintain over a long period of time. That's why people who exercise, you obviously, when you undergo, like, if it's a physical activity that you are taking part in regularly, then over time your body and your heart sort of adjust to that, and it doesn't increase as much as it would if you're doing it out of the blue, like if you decide just to start running all of a sudden. Then obviously the this effect on your body would be much more as compared to if you jog or run on a regular basis, and so your body sort of adjusts to some extent to that level of activity. All right, so next up we have the it does mention coronary heart disease, but I'm going to skip that. I'm going to talk about blood vessels. So we've got three types of blood vessels in our body. We have the arteries, we have the veins, and we have the capillaries. And how this goes is you've got the arteries that are carrying blood away from the heart, right? When they reach the body, they become smaller and smaller, and they finally become the smallest blood vessels, right? The capillaries, and these form a network throughout the body, providing, supplying blood, and obviously by supplying blood, supplying everything that the blood is carrying, or right, or anything that needs to be taken up by the blood to all cells of the body, right? So there's no part of the body that does not have a blood supply. Some areas are supplied with more blood than others, but right, it's all over the body. And finally, the capillaries join up to form smaller veins, and then regular, I would say, sized veins, or any right. So basically, uh, these are taking blood away from the heart, and these are supplying blood to the body, and these are taking blood to the heart. So you got these three types of vessels. We'll talk about each in turn. There's not a lot to talk about in O level, but still. Right, so arteries, as I mentioned, they carry blood away from the heart to the body, or in the case of the pulmonary artery, to the lungs. And right, the blood is usually oxygenated. Why are we saying usually? Because you have the pulmonary artery, which is carrying deoxygenated blood to the lungs. Right, and then they have thick muscular walls. They have a narrow lumen, meaning a narrow, right, opening for the blood to pass, even though the artery itself is thick, but the right the space for the blood to move through is narrow. Why? Because all of this is like muscle, right? And elastic, elastic fiber tissue and muscle fiber. So arteries, narrow lumen and elastic tissue and muscle fiber. So these are what make up the walls of the artery. And the reason for that is because, as we've mentioned, blood in the artery is under pressure. And so we know pressure is force upon area. So a lot of force is being exerted on the walls of the artery, right? And so you need thick, muscular, elastic, right? So the pulse that you feel is actually when the blood goes through, right? As the blood is passing through the artery, because of its elasticity, it sort of expands to allow for the pressure. So it's expanding, right? It's decreasing the pressure being felt by the wall. And so obviously reducing risk of any physical damage because of the pressure of the blood. And so that is basically what the pulse that you measure, right? The pulse that you feel is. So the elasticity and the muscular toughness and the thickness, right, allow for that blood under high pressure to pass through, and that's why you need it. So we'll see that the capillaries, obviously they have none of this, and the veins do not have a thick layer of muscles, and that's because the blood, by the time it reaches the veins, is under considerably lower pressure, much lower pressure. So the arteries divide, and they keep dividing into four smaller and smaller arteries until they form microscopic vessels. So these guys you cannot see with your eyes directly, right? These are microscopic vessels. And they branch and, as I mentioned, form a network supplying all cells of the body with blood. And they are very thin. Their diameter is 0.001 millimeter, or it could be said only 1 micrometer diameter. And they're only like they're only big enough, right? I'm not going to draw another circle around this because, right, they're only one cell. The wall is of the capillaries are only one cell thick. Right? So you could say it's a single layer of cells with the walls of the capillaries, and they're only wide enough for a single red blood cell to pass through. Right. Now, although it's only one cell thick, not everything can leave the walls. Not everything can, leave the capillary. Right. So water, glucose, O2 and CO2, obviously, right? Nutrients, some wastes. All of these can leave. Some cells known as white blood cells, they can leave. But then you've got others such as proteins and stuff, right? Larger molecules, they cannot leave the capillary. So they stay in the capillary, they stay in the blood, right? Okay. And then once all of that is done, then they join back up to form what are called veins. Any questions, by the way? Hello?
No.
Okay. So, as mentioned, veins return blood to the heart. And there is, you know, much less pressure in them as compared to arteries. Right, and so they have a wider lumen and thinner walls as compared to arteries. And those thinner walls, right, they have less elastic and less muscle tissue and more of fibrous tissue. So less elastic and muscle tissue, more fibrous tissue. And as I mentioned, right, they have valves. And right, so veins overall have valves, and that's because the pressure of the blood is so low that, right, in arteries it's so high that it's being pushed in one direction. And also you have sort of, as I mentioned, that elastic movement. So, and then you have the contraction of the muscles, so they all push the blood, right? It's going one way. In the veins it's under low pressure, so they have valves to prevent the backflow of blood. And also, right, the contraction of the muscles help push the blood forward in the veins all the way back up to the heart. That is why walking, or even if you're sitting for a long time, if you're standing for a long time in a single place without moving about, then you need to contract your calf muscles at least to keep the blood moving up, because it has happened that people who've kept standing for, like for example, people in the military, and they're standing for a parade and they're standing for a long period of time in the same position without moving, and they fall unconscious. Why? Because blood sort of collects in the legs, there's not enough blood going up, and so they actually faint because of lack of blood and oxygen to the brain. So that happens. Okay. So the blood in most veins is deoxygenated, except for the pulmonary vein, which is bringing back oxygenated blood from the lungs to the heart. Now, with that, so there's some major arteries and veins that supply blood to certain parts or certain organs. And so let's talk about some of them. We know about the aorta and the vena cava and the pulmonary artery and the pulmonary vein, right? And so you have the hepatic artery, and this is supplying blood to the liver, right? And coming out of the hepatic artery, you obviously have the hepatic vein, right? Uh, then you have the hepatic portal vein, which we came across in a previous chapter. And this is the vein that's going from the intestines, small intestine, to the liver. So in this case, right, the liver is actually being supplied with two, right, blood from two vessels. Right, liver is being supplied by two vessels. So one is the hepatic artery and the other, right. So the hepatic artery is also bringing blood to the liver, and the hepatic portal vein is also bringing blood to the liver. Obviously, the artery is bringing oxygenated blood, and the hepatic portal vein is bringing deoxygenated blood, but it is rich in nutrients. Then you have the renal artery that supplies the kidneys, right, and it leaves as the renal vein. And so there are two of them because you've got two kidneys, right? So each kidney has a renal artery coming in and a renal vein going out.
Like every organ has a different artery and vein.
In I mean, mostly yes, right. uh, we are not talking about each and every one, right. For example, they haven't mentioned the coronary artery. I mean, we are going to talk about coronary heart disease, and so there's the coronary arteries, right, which supply the heart, right. So when blood leaves the heart from the aorta, right, part of it splits and forms the coronary artery, which supplies the heart itself with blood and oxygen and all the exchange of nutrients and waste materials, right. So yeah, right. Major parts of the body and major organs have specific arteries going to them and then veins coming out. That was your question, right?
Yes.
Okay.
Like how many veins are there?
How many veins are there? Like as in
Veins and arteries.
you want a number?
Yeah.
Okay.
Approximately like how many there are.
I'll have to look it up. Just give me a minute.
Okay.
So how many arteries and veins in the human body? If you're talking about the major ones, right? Then there are 160 arteries and 200 major veins. Okay? We're talking about the major ones, like the big ones,
Yeah.
right? In total, right, the blood supply, the vessels in the body are estimated to be around or more than 60,000 miles. So we do mile to kilometer and we go, okay, 60,000. And that's 96,560.64 kilometers. That's like 96, a bit more than 96 and thousand. Yeah, nearly 90, you could say perhaps 97,000 kilometers of blood vessels in your body. So you can imagine how extensive the blood network is.
Yeah.
Yes? Okay. Anything else?
And like and like the size of the human heart is the same as the one of like a cow or similar thing, yeah?
What's the same as a cow?
Like the human heart and the size.
Oh, no. No. Right?
Is it bigger or like,
The cow's heart is probably bigger than a human's. That's an interesting question. Yes, it is significantly bigger. So obviously, the size of the heart is excuse me. The size of the heart is sort it corresponds to the size of the body of the animal because you need that kind of heart and that kind of pressure to pump blood throughout the body. Right. So, for example, I'll tell you something. Right. What's the size of the heart of a whale? You're familiar with a whale,
Yeah.
right? The uh, uh, the heart of a whale is about 450 kilograms. It is roughly 5 feet tall, and it can pump around 220 liters of blood per beat. Okay,
Yeah. Yeah.
so it's big, just the heart, and that makes sense because whales are big, right? So obviously they aren't able to function with a heart the size of a human or a cow's, right?
Yes.
Okay, so moving on.
Like,
Hmm.
um, does our heart also like continues to develop until a certain age, like just like the lungs?
All our organs are that way,
Okay.
right? So they continue to develop and they continue to mature up until a certain age when they're said to be fully developed and mature, right? I mean, obviously, a newborn baby does have all the organs, right? But obviously, they're small and they don't function uh, to their full capacity, right?
Yeah.
So, yes. Okay. Next up is talking about the blood, right? So, what is our blood made up of? Blood is made up of red blood cells, which you can call RBCs, white blood cells, and there, right, there's only one type of red blood cell, but there are different types of white blood cells, and you can call them WBCs. There are something called platelets. There's plasma, which is the liquid part of the blood, which is mostly water. Right, and then there are others dissolved, like there are proteins, the plasma proteins, and then there are nutrients in CO2 and O2 and all of that. So those are not like what make up the blood, but that's in the blood. So we're not going to talk about that. We're going to talk about what makes up the blood. So first of all, we have our RBCs, red blood cells, and we have obviously millions of them. They are tiny disc-shaped cells, right? They are biconcave, which means they are sort of pressed in from both sides, right? So they're pressed in from here and they're pressed in and they're thicker on the edges. And what's interesting about them is that they do not have a nucleus. So there's no nucleus. So you asked what body cell does not have a nucleus, right? And you say red blood cell. Uh, they haven't, right? Their cytoplasm is spongy and their cell membrane is elastic. And this actually helps them move through the capillaries because sometimes the capillary is even smaller than the size of a red blood cell. So the red blood cell has to squeeze through, and for that, it sort of like changes shape temporarily. So that's where the elasticity helps. And the cytoplasm contains, right, a protein called hemoglobin. And this is the one that binds oxygen and transports it all over the body, right? So it binds it where there's a high concentration of oxygen, which is the lungs, and it gives it up where there's a low concentration, which is, right, the body cells. And hemoglobin is the one that also gives the red coloration to the blood. And the right hemoglobin plus oxygen is called oxyhemoglobin. Right, so not a difficult name. It's oxy meaning oxygen and hemoglobin. Right, so the vessels that are carrying, a greater percentage of oxyhemoglobin, those are like, in fact, blood that has more oxyhemoglobin in it is oxygenated blood, and blood that has little oxyhemoglobin in it, is called deoxygenated. Now, because they do not have a nucleus, they only have a lifespan of 4 months, after which they die and they are recycled. Right, now the recycling and everything, right, are details that we don't need to get into. And so, right, it's not happening all in one go, right? So it's happening on a daily basis. What does that mean? That every day, right, the book gives a number 200,000 million. 200,000 million, right, RBCs per day are recycled. Why? Because they were produced and they've been in the blood for about 4 months. And so you're getting new red blood cells every day, replacing the old ones, right? It's not like every 4 months all the blood suddenly is broken down and then all of it is replaced, right? That would be problematic because then your body will not have any hemoglobin to carry the oxygen for some time and you would die, obviously, right? So it happens every day, regularly, right? Not all of a sudden. And uh, right, it seems like a huge number, but it is only about 1% of the total number of red blood cells we have in our body, right? So it's you're only replacing, so every 100 days, every 4 months or so, all the blood in your body is new, and then after a few days it starts again. And red blood cells are made in the red bone marrow of bones. Right, and not all bones, but certain parts such as the ribs and the chest, the sternum, and the vertebrae. So ribs, sternum, which is the chest bone, and vertebrae, which is basically the backbone. Any questions?
No.
Okay, next up we have white blood cells. And these guys are basically involved in our body's immune and defense. So when we say immune system, when we say immunity, right, this is what we're talking about. We're talking about our white blood cells. There are different types, but we're going to generally categorize them as either phagocytes or lymphocytes. When before going into that, they are bigger in size than are red blood cells, and they're lesser in number. So there's one to every about 600 uh, red blood cells, right? So one white blood cell to every 600 red blood cells. So they're much less than the red blood cells. So they're phagocytes and lymphocytes. These are the two main types. There are other subtypes, but as far as right your syllabus is concerned, we're going to go into detail about them in the next chapter, I believe, disease and immunity.
Sir,
Yeah.
like if a person has a weak immune system, then his WBCs are not working properly. Um,
Well, it depends on what kind of maybe they don't have enough white blood cells. Maybe they're not working properly. It could be various conditions. Just saying that they have weak immunity, right? Maybe they're unable to develop immunity for some reason, and so yeah, that is some sort of malfunction in the working of the white blood cells.
okay.
Okay, so right, the lymphocytes produce proteins called antibodies, which mark bacteria or other pathogens, right? It's sort of like a detection. And phagocytes, they right perform a process called phagocytosis, cytosis, right? And which basically means that they engulf, for example, bacteria, the pathogen. So they take it up into so they're big cell, right? And so they eat the pathogen, they eat the bacteria, for example, and digest it, and that way they get rid of it, right? And uh, right, or perhaps right, we're talking about old damaged cells or dying cells or dead cells. So for those as well, or something else. And they are very fluid, right? So they're able to they are fluid, which means they can easily move through the walls of the capillary walls, and that way they can be present among the body cells, in between the body cells. Then we have platelets, and these are pieces of some blood cells that are formed in the red bone marrow.
What's a bone marrow?
Bone marrow is the substance that is inside bones. So our bones are not hollow, they're not empty. There's stuff inside the bones as well, right? And they help in the process of clotting. So that's when the skin breaks and there's a wound and there's blood coming out, and when that heals and the blood stops, it thickens and it stops bleeding out, right? That is the process of clotting. And so that stops bleeding, so that stops loss of blood, and it also prevents pathogens from entering the wound. Now, since you mentioned clotting, a bit of detail about that. Right, so when blood vessels are damaged, right, and blood starts coming out of the vessels, right, platelets, they clump together and block smaller capillaries. So that is the first step of blocking the loss of blood. And then they produce substances that, through a series of enzyme action, they form a plasma protein, a soluble plasma protein called fibrinogen. So that is released by the platelets. Fibrinogen. And that is changed into an insoluble protein called fibrin. And so what this fibrin does, it forms like a net across the wound. Right? And so red blood cells get trapped in that net, and that stops bleeding. Right? And also prevents access of pathogens into the body through the wound. And in case, right, if everything's okay, right, when that happens, when there's a wound, the body sends white blood cells to that area as well. So if there's any pathogen or anything that comes in, then they are dealt with immediately by the white blood cells. And that is why we do not get infections from every single cut or bruise or scrape or scratch that we get, right? Because the body is able to handle those. Any questions?
No.
There's an illustration in the book about clotting, so you can take a look at that, obviously. And we only have, so we've just give me 2 more minutes. I missed this part. The last thing I'll talk about today, I guess, is plasma. So plasma, as I mentioned, is the liquid part of the blood. And right, it is what transports the blood cells to the RBCs and all the other dissolved substances, right, as well as sodium and potassium. So you've got, right, the RBCs and the WBCs and the nutrients and everything else going in there. Right, so sodium, potassium, calcium chloride, hydrogen carbonate, all of those, uh, right, in varying amounts. There's also hormones being carried, and also excretory products such as CO2 or urea, right? And the organs that are important in keeping the composition of the plasma stable are the liver and kidney. Right, so they will maintain how much uh, water there is, right? How much of the nutrients there are, how much of the waste materials there are. Obviously, as far as carbon dioxide is concerned, that's for the lungs to do. And so there's a table in the book that sort of summarizes where each substance is coming from in the blood. So oxygen, carbon dioxide, urea, hormones, diet, food, and heat, and where it's going to. Right, so that's something to look at. For example, heat is coming from the abdomen, and then it's transported to the whole body, right? And hormones are coming from glands, so whatever glands there are, and they're going to the target organs, right? Carbon dioxide is coming from the whole body and then going to the lungs. So that's table present in the book. You can take a look at that. And with that, the only thing left to talk about is heart disease, right? So obviously I'm not going over that. It's not a long topic, but we are out of time. So the next time, right? And it will be a nice tie-in. We'll talk about heart disease, and then we'll start chapter 12, which is disease and immunity. Any questions?
No.
Then I'll see you next time, inshallah.
Allah Hafiz.